What if the only person who could save a hive of billions was the man everyone stepped over without a second thought? The question echoes like a whisper through the choking smog of Vardis 9, a hive city so enormous and overpopulated that even the Emperor himself might struggle to remember every soul trapped within its metal lungs. The hive never sleeps. It groans, rattles, and pulses like a wounded beast, its layers stacked upon each other in a suffocating maze of rust, fumes, and forgotten human misery. And somewhere deep in this maze, far below the titanic spires and long above the sludge pits, walks a solitary figure pushing a battered cleaning cart, its wheels squeaking in protest with every turn. His name is Lorien Hale, a man unnoticed by everyone except the filth he fights every day. A man who has spent decades sweeping corridors no one else dares enter. A man who knows the hive's pipes, vents, and arteries better than any map ever printed. He has no medals, no rank, no power. Just a mop, a wrench, and the stubborn determination to keep the city from drowning in its own decay. But lately, something has been wrong with Vardis 9, wrong in a way that claws at the nerves, wrong in a way that makes the air feel thicker than it should be. Lorien has noticed things others have ignored, a strange sweet smell lingering in corners no one passes, stains on walls that pulse faintly when touched, rust that grows too fast, and drains that echo with wet, muffled whispers. The workers joke about the hive rotting from the inside, but only Lorien senses that this time, it isn't a joke. This time, the rot feels alive. He tries to dismiss it. He tells himself it's just another day, another shift, another 20 hours spent dragging his cart through the labyrinth while people walk past him as though he isn't there. But deep down, something cold and heavy coils in his chest, a feeling he cannot quite name. A sense that something beneath the hive is awakening. Something old, something foul, something that has been waiting for far too long. Tonight, as the lights flicker overhead with the rhythmic tremor of failing power lines, Lorien pauses. For a moment, the entire corridor becomes silent, unnaturally silent. He hears it clearly this time, a faint, wet chuckle echoing from the pipes behind the wall. A sound that slithers like diseased breath, a sound no human throat could produce. He stands frozen. The mop handle tightens in his grip. He knows he should walk away. He knows he should clock out, go home, pretend he heard nothing, just as he has done 1,000 times before. But something about this moment feels different. Something about the whispering, the stench, the strange stains, the disappearing workers, all of it feels like pieces of a puzzle he has tried too long to ignore. And as that sickly chuckle fades back into the metal veins of the hive, Lorien Hale suddenly realizes a terrible truth. He is the only one who hears the warning, the only one who sees the signs. And in a hive city this massive, this fragile, and this forgotten by the Imperium, being the only one who notices might also mean being the only one who can stop what comes next. Lorien continued his shift with the same patient rhythm he had carried for decades, but tonight every sound felt sharper, every shadow thicker, every breath more difficult. The hive was sick. He felt it in the way the walls seemed to sweat, in the strange humidity clinging to the air, in the way his boots stuck slightly to the grated floor as though the metal itself exhaled rot. He pushed his cart toward the lower maintenance levels, where refuse collected faster than any team could keep up with, and where he often found himself alone for hours at a time. His superiors insisted the lower ducts were sealed, that no new access points existed, yet Lorien knew the hive better than most. It changed constantly, shifting, settling, cracking under its own weight. On nights like this, the city felt alive in all the wrong ways. He swept another pile of industrial waste into a collection bin when his broom hit something solid beneath the trash. Not a pipe, not the grating, something smooth, metallic, and entirely out of place. He knelt down, pushing rubbish aside, torn ration wrappers, rusted bolts, clumps of unidentifiable sludge. Beneath it all was a rectangular patch of metal, darker than the surrounding floor plates, with an oily green sheen that reflected the corridor lights in a sickly way. Lorien frowned. He had cleaned this corridor hundreds of times. This hatch had never been here. He ran his fingers across it. The metal was warm, almost pulsing. And worse, when he pressed his ear close, he could hear something behind it. A slow, sticky dripping. A faint rustle like something shifting in the dark. His hand trembled as he found the recessed latch, not a standard hive city mechanism. Something older. Something sealed deliberately. When he pulled it, a hiss escaped, carrying with it a foul, humid breath that struck him like a physical blow. The air that rose from beneath the hatch smelled of rotten sweetness twisted together into something nauseating. A slick, greenish ooze seeped up along the edges, trailing down into the rubbish at his feet. Lorien recoiled, wiping his hands on his uniform as his heart thudded painfully against his ribs. This wasn't right, this wasn't normal. The hive had many problems, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt alive. He glanced around. No patrols, no supervisors, no one to witness him opening something he definitely shouldn't. And yet he couldn't look away. The hatch seemed to draw him in, whispering in a voice too soft for words but too clear to be imagined. Something about it demanded attention, demanded acknowledgement. It felt like a secret the hive itself had tried desperately to bury and had only now begun to vomit back up. Lorien's thoughts raced. Should he report it? They would laugh. They always did. They'd tell him to clean it up. Patch it over. Ignore it. But he couldn't ignore the warm ooze sliding between the plates. Couldn't ignore the sound, now unmistakably wet, rhythmic, like a heartbeat trapped deep beneath the garbage-smothered floor. He dropped the hatch shut, but even closed, it throbbed faintly under his palm, beating out a message he didn't understand. Not yet. For the first time in his long, lonely career, Lorien Hale felt fear that had nothing to do with criminals, malfunctioning machinery, or corrupt hive officials. This fear was ancient, primal, and silent, like the hive had become a living thing, and something inside it had begun to wake up hungry. He stepped back, breath unsteady. He didn't know what this hatch was. He didn't know who put it there. But he knew with absolute certainty that it didn't belong. And whatever was growing beneath it, whatever was whispering through the pipes, was the kind of thing that could swallow a city whole if left unchecked. And Lorien Hale was the only one who had found it. The only one who had seen the first crack in the hive's armor. The only one who would know where the horror had begun. The smell of that hidden hatch clung to Lorien long after he walked away from it. No matter how many corridors he scrubbed or how deeply he breathed, he could still taste the sweetness of rot at the back of his throat, like something trying to crawl its way into his lungs. He tried to distract himself with routine, pushing his cart from one sector to another, wiping down consoles, clearing refuse, unclogging drains clogged with factory filth and human neglect. But the hive felt wrong tonight, off rhythm, off balance. Lights flickered in patterns too irregular to be simple malfunctions. Steam vents exhaled in uneven bursts. The distant hum of machinery had taken on a hollow undertone, like the hive was groaning through a fever. He was scrubbing a spill of machine oil when he heard it, a wet cough that echoed sharply through the metal corridor. Not the usual smoker's wheeze or factory worker hack. This one was deeper, filled with liquid. Gurgling. Lorien froze, listening. A second cough followed, then a thud, something heavy hitting the floor. He abandoned his cart and hurried toward the sound, boots clanging against the grated walkway. The first thing he noticed was the smell, thicker and sweeter than anything he'd encountered before, a stench that seemed to ooze through the air like syrup. The second thing was the figure sprawled on the ground. A man in a worker's uniform lay face down, trembling violently as though every muscle in his body was twisting in revolt. Lorien rushed to him, kneeling carefully. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked, but the worker didn't answer. He only shook harder, his back rising and falling in sick, irregular spasms. When Lorien gently turned him over, the breath caught in his throat. The man's face was swollen and blotched with dark green patches, each one pulsing faintly beneath the skin. Thick ropes of mucus clung to his mouth. His eyes were open, bloodshot, watery, and filled with sheer animal terror. The worker's lips moved, trying to form words, but only bubbles rose from his throat. Lorien wiped away the slime, desperate to help, but the worker suddenly seized his wrist with surprising strength. His grip was cold, clammy. His fingers left a sticky residue on Lorien's skin. Then, with a choking gasp, the man whispered something. Just one word. Lorien. The janitor froze. The worker had never met him. No one knew his name unless they looked at his badge, and this man hadn't had the strength to open his eyes, let alone read. The whisper didn't feel like a call for help. It felt like a warning, or a recognition of something the dying man shouldn't have been able to sense. Before Lorien could speak, the worker convulsed again, arching unnaturally. A burst of foul, greenish fluid erupted from his lungs, splattering the floor with a hiss that almost sounded alive. His body shuddered once, then collapsed into a limp, twisted heap. The sweet smell thickened, flooding Lorien's senses. He stumbled back, covering his mouth. Within seconds, Administratum security arrived, too quickly, as if they had been waiting. They shoved Lorien aside and surrounded the corpse. One officer scanned the body while another barked orders, telling bystanders to clear out, to forget what they saw. Their movements were too rehearsed, their silence too deliberate. When Lorien explained what happened, the officer barely glanced at him before muttering that it was industrial contamination, nothing more. A simple accident, nothing worth reporting. But Lorien saw the way they avoided touching the body. Saw how they winced when they smelled the rot. Saw how the corpse was sealed instantly in a containment shroud thicker than anything used for normal industrial accidents. And as they carried the body away, Lorien noticed something smeared on the floor where the man's hand had been. A trail of green ooze that pulsed faintly, then slowly sank between the metal plates, disappearing as though the hive itself absorbed it. He stepped back, heart pounding. First the hatch, now a man dying of something no one could explain, and that single whispered word, his name, echoed in his skull like a curse. Lorien Hale wasn't superstitious, but as he watched the administratum hastily vanish into the upper corridors, he felt a truth settling over him like dust from a collapsed ceiling. Whatever was happening in the depths of Vardis -9, it had already claimed its first victim. And it was calling for him. The corridor felt colder after the body was taken away, as though the death of that worker had drained warmth from the very air. Lorien stood alone beside his abandoned cart, staring at the floor where the man's final breath had spilled. The administratum officers had scrubbed the scene with industrial-strength solvents, but the sweet, rotten scent still lingered in the edges of his senses, clinging to the back of his throat. He rubbed the patch of his sleeve where the dying man had gripped him. Even now, the spot felt colder than the rest of his uniform, as though the touch had left a stain no cleaning chemical could erase. He knew he should return to his duties, cleaning, repairing, keeping silent. That was the life of a janitor in a hive, constant motion, invisible existence. But tonight, Lorien's heart refused to settle. The image of the worker's face, swollen, discolored, begging to speak, haunted him. And worse, that whispered word kept echoing in his skull with every step he took. His name, spoken by a man drowning in his own blood, a man who should have had no way to know who he was. Lorien forced himself toward the nearest Vox terminal. He hesitated only briefly before pressing the call button. The line crackled, and a bored voice answered in the flat monotone of overworked hive personnel. Maintenance Division, state your report. Lorien swallowed. This is Janitor Hale. Worker collapse, Section 9, lower corridor. Symptoms don't match industrial exposure. Flesh discoloration, rapid swelling, fluid discharge. Extremely abnormal. He paused, then added, there's something wrong in the walls. The pipes. I heard, sir. The voice interrupted sharply, we've already logged the event. The incident was contamination related. Continue your shift. Lorien's grip tightened. This wasn't contamination. I've seen contamination. This was different. There's a hatch down here that shouldn't exist. No unauthorized hatches exist in registered maintenance zones, the voice said, tone shifting from disinterest to irritation. If you discovered anything, it was a mislabeled utility panel. Your job is to clean, not investigate. Return to your duties. Lorien felt frustration boiling in his chest. Listen to me, there's something down here. Something leaking into the ducts. The worker said my name before he. The voice cut him off again. Report completed. Do not clog official lines with speculation. Resume your assigned route. The connection clicked dead. No sympathy. No curiosity. Not even a shred of caution. The worker's death, the pulsating hatch, the sickly rot, it all meant nothing to them. A janitor raising concerns carried less weight than a malfunctioning cogitator screen. He stared at the silent Vox terminal, jaw clenched. He wanted to scream, to demand attention, to tell them that something ancient and foul was crawling its way through Vardus 9. But he knew how the hive worked. People didn't listen to warnings until the walls bled and the streets vomited corpses. Annoyed, he resumed his route, yet everywhere he looked, he saw signs he'd overlooked before. The flickering lights weren't random, they pulsed like arrhythmic heartbeats. The humming pipes didn't sound like machinery, they throbbed with the faint, organic cadence of something alive. Even the stains he scrubbed smeared like coagulated flesh rather than old grease. A pair of workers passed him, coughing violently, their skin pale and clammy. Lorien stopped them, asking if they'd noticed anything strange. They brushed him off. Just the usual hive sickness, one muttered. Air's filthy. Pipes leak. What's new? But Lorien knew the hive. He knew its grime, its decay, its illnesses. This wasn't the usual fatigue of overworked lungs or chemical irritation. This was something else, something spreading. Hours later, as his shift dragged on, he paused in a narrow maintenance corridor beneath the ventilation arteries. Something dripped from the ceiling, thick, greenish fluid. It hit the floor with a sticky splat. Lorien stepped closer, reaching out with a gloved hand, but before he touched it, the droplet quivered. Shivered, moved, as though reacting to him. He staggered backward, breath caught in his chest. He stared up at the ceiling, where more droplets formed slowly along the seams, swelling like blisters about to burst. The hive was not simply rotting. It was infected. The worker who died was not the first casualty. And if no one in authority cared, Lorien realized with a chill that he might be the only person in Vardis 9 who understood the truth. The hive-city had started warning him. Pulsing, whispering, leaking, and beneath it all, something whispered in a voice that slithered through pipes and metal veins, something that seemed to know his name already. The hive wasn't asking for help. It was telling him what was coming. The night shift in Vardis 9 was always quieter, but never peaceful. The hive didn't rest, it only changed tempo, dropping into a slower, heavier rhythm that made every distant thud and echo feel unnervingly amplified. Lorien had worked nights for decades, and he'd grown used to the strange solitude that crept through the empty corridors once the day workers retreated to their cramped habs. But tonight, the silence carried a new weight. It pressed against him like a heavy fog, thick with the stench of something unseen. He pushed his cart through a lower-level service tunnel, the wheels squeaking in the stillness. The lights above him flickered in irregular patterns, casting twitching shadows that stretched unnaturally along the walls. The humming of pipes, usually steady, predictable, had taken on a wet, sluggish tone, like thick fluid sloshing behind the metal. Lorien felt the hairs on his arms rise. Every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. The rot had grown stronger. Not the normal hive rot, but something sweet and choking, something that seeped into the back of the throat and refused to leave. Lorien tightened his grip on his mop handle as he entered a wider chamber where multiple tunnels converged. This area was usually bustling with maintenance crew during peak hours. Now, it lay silent and empty, illuminated by a single failing lumen strip that buzzed like an angry insect. He had barely taken 3 steps inside when he heard it. A sound he could never mistake. Movement. Wet, dragging movement. Not the stride of boots. Not the scuttle of a rat. Something slower, heavier, pulling itself across the floor. Lorien froze, heart thudding. He scanned the shadows between the tunnels, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the faintest glimmer of something slick and green slid across the floor. At first, he thought it was spilled chemical coolant. But coolant didn't move with intention. Coolant didn't gather itself into a lump the size of a small animal. And coolant didn't shift its shape as though breathing. The mass twitched. Then it quivered. And then, with a wet pop, it sprouted a tiny maw, ringed with jagged, needle-like teeth. Lorien stumbled back, gripping a railing to steady himself. His mind raced. He'd read horror stories of the warp's corruption, whispered tales of plague entities born from filth and despair. He'd always dismissed them as exaggerations, stories to scare workers into staying on their assigned routes. But the creature on the floor was no story. It looked up at him with a wet, hungry gurgle, leaking pus onto the metal plates. It crawled toward him, slowly, deliberately, leaving a shimmering trail of foul ooze behind it. Panic surged through Lorien, but he forced himself to remain still. Running would only draw its attention. Slowly, he reached for the portable incinerator attached to his cart. His hands trembled. The creature crept closer, its tiny body quivering with anticipation. It let out a bubbling chirp, almost playful, almost childlike, yet dripping with corruption. Lorien clicked the ignition. A small flame hissed to life. The creature reacted instantly, shuddering backward with a screeching hiss that sounded more like steam escaping a ruptured pipe. Its flesh bubbled, its form sagging like melting wax. It writhed violently for a moment, then dissolved into a puddle of steaming sludge, leaving behind a smell so foul it burned Lorien's eyes. He staggered away, choking on the stink. The portable incinerator's flame sputtered out, and for a long moment, he stood there in the dim, flickering light, hands shaking, breath quivering, heart hammering like a frantic piston. He'd killed it, whatever it was, but the horror didn't end there. Because as the echo of the creature's dying hiss faded, another sound rose from the tunnels. A whispering chorus. Not one voice, not 2, dozens. Whispers slithering through pipes and vents. Soft, gurgling, laughing. The same sickly chuckle he had heard before, now multiplied, growing, spreading. Lorien staggered backward, his mind spiraling with dread. This wasn't a single infection. This wasn't an isolated anomaly. What he had burned was just a fragment, a symptom. The true sickness was awakening in the depths. It was multiplying in the hidden arteries of the hive, gathering strength with each passing hour. And as the whispers grew louder, merging into a nauseating chorus of gleeful, corrupted delight, Lorien realized with bone-deep certainty. The night shift wasn't empty anymore. Something else was here now. Something watching, something crawling, something learning, and it had noticed him. The janitor, still trembling from what he had witnessed deep beneath the reactor pit, stepped back into the service corridors with a strange mixture of dread and determination. The echo of the chanting Nurgle cultists, those slow, guttural, plague-ridden whispers, still clung to his mind like clotted filth. But now he carried something he had not possessed before, information. Dangerous, terrifying, potentially city-saving information. And in a hive this enormous, information was more powerful than any lasgun he could ever lift. But the problem remained. Who would believe him? He was just a janitor. A disposable, unnoticed soul in a city of trillions. Someone whose absence wouldn't even register in the shift logs. And yet, the cultists were real. He had nearly been discovered by them. Their corruption was spreading faster than the sanitation department could process regular waste, let alone plague-tainted biomass. If he didn't act soon, the outbreak would rise from the lower levels like a tide of rot and drown the hive. He began walking, keeping to the narrow maintenance paths where security patrols rarely bothered to look. His mind swirled with options. He could report it to his supervisor, but his supervisor barely allowed him to take sick leave and certainly wouldn't risk angering higher management with unverified claims. The Arbits, they were too far away, too bureaucratic, and too ready to dismiss a frightened laborer as delusional. The local PDF, they weren't allowed in the lower waste zones without authorization from 5 different departments. The janitor's breath steamed in the cold, recycled air as panic tried to take him again. If no one believes me, then the city is doomed. He stopped. The hum of industrial processors filled the corridor. He stared at the flashing lights of a data terminal access panel set into the wall. And that's when the idea hit him, something bold, borderline insane, and incredibly dangerous. The Mechanicus. No one ever tried to speak to the Adeptus Mechanicus directly. They were reclusive, devout to a machine logic entirely alien to the hive's common workers. But they did respond to threats that endangered the hive's infrastructure, especially plague contamination that could compromise their sacred machinery. If the janitor could reach the right conduit, flag the right security protocol, trigger the right type of warning, the tech priests would have no choice but to investigate. He approached the panel. His hands shook. The Mechanicus did not tolerate unauthorized tampering. But what was worse, execution for meddling with their systems. Or watching an entire hive city rot into a garden of Nurgle. He pressed the panel open. Sparks jumped. The smell of burnt dust rose. He stared at the interface, a maze of symbols he barely understood. He whispered to himself, "You clean these halls every day. You've seen their patterns. You can do this." Using a combination of observation, memory, and pure desperation, he navigated the machine spirit's primitive interface. Incorrect entries buzzed angrily, causing his heart to jump into his throat. Warnings flashed. Denial runes blinked. The machine spirit resisted him with cold, ancient stubbornness. But he kept trying. He input contamination levels he had never seen before. He cross-linked disposal reports with unsanctioned biological growth. He manually altered routine sanitation logs to create a chain of impossible readings, enough to trigger emergency escalation protocols. Finally, the panel paused. The lights on the wall dimmed. The floor thrummed beneath his feet. A deep, mechanical voice echoed from the Vox speaker. Unsanctioned access detected. Data pattern anomalous. Initiating tech priest investigation. Remained stationary. His blood ran cold. Footsteps, heavy, metallic, rhythmic, approached from the ascending corridor. The janitor swallowed hard. "Emperor, please let me not have made a mistake." But it was too late. The Mechanicus was coming, and whatever happened next would decide whether the hive city lived, or whether Nurgle's rot would claim its billions. The janitor stood frozen as the echoes of the approaching footsteps grew louder, each clang of metal against the grated floor reverberating through the service corridor like a countdown to judgment. Tech priests were not known for patience, nor mercy, nor for listening to the panicked words of a low-level worker. They acted on data, cold, unquestionable data, and he had just fed their systems a series of emergency-level contamination alerts. The corridor lights flickered, momentarily dimming as if bowing to some unseen authority. A low electronic hum settled over the air, and the janitor felt tiny hairs rise along his arms as if charged by static. Then, from around the corner, the figure emerged. A tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus, towering, robed in crimson, half human, half machine, advanced with a spider-like grace. Servo arms clicked and writhed behind him. His augmetic eyes glowed a cold, analytical blue, each lens focusing and refocusing on the janitor with unsettling precision. Behind him shuffled two Skitarii escorts, their weapons held ready, their presence a silent threat. "Identify yourself," the tech priest intoned, voice layered with metallic distortion. The janitor tried to speak, but his mouth had gone dry. I'm just a janitor. Maintenance worker. Level 9. Sanitation." The tech priest's head tilted slightly, mechanical joints whirring. "You triggered a level 7 contamination protocol. Explain." The janitor swallowed. "There's something down there. In the lower waste sectors. A group. A cult. They're spreading some kind of plague. I saw bodies, strange growths, symbols, people chanting. It wasn't natural. It wasn't human." The Skitarii lifted their weapons half an inch. The tech priest raised a hand, and they stilled. "You are not authorized to access or alter Mechanicus systems. Such action warrants summary execution." The janitor felt his knees weaken. His vision blurred. He wanted to run, but his legs locked in place. I know. But I had to. No one listens to us. We're invisible down here. If I didn't do something, that plague would spread. It's already spreading. I'm telling the truth. I swear on the Emperor himself." For several long seconds, nothing moved, not even the Skitarii. Only the soft hum of machinery and the janitor's labored breathing filled the corridor. Then the tech priest leaned closer. A cable snaked forward, connecting to the data port he had accessed. His augmetic eyes flickered faster and faster, processing the falsified contamination logs, the impossible biological readings, the hazardous growth patterns, and one small detail the janitor had not intended, a scrap of corrupted data that was not his doing. The machine spirit had detected something before he triggered anything. A low, dissonant tone sounded from the tech priest's chest-mounted Vox unit. "Data correlation complete," he announced. "Your report is plausible." The janitor exhaled sharply, half collapsing with relief, until the tech priest added, "The spread of heretical biological corruption represents a threat to the machine god's domain. Immediate investigation is mandated." The tech priest extended a servo arm, pointing down the tunnel toward the restricted waste zones. "You will guide us." The janitor blinked. Me? Why? I'm not trained. I'm just." "You initiated the alert," the tech priest responded. "You provided the data. You possess locational awareness. Your soft tissues are expendable." His heart stopped for half a second. Expendable, yes. Before he could protest, one Skitarius seized his arm with crushing metal fingers, propelling him forward. He stumbled, catching himself against the wall. The tech priest and escorts followed, their footsteps echoing like the march of judgment itself. Together, they moved deeper into the hive, toward the contaminated tunnels, the cult's hidden chamber, and the festering heart of the outbreak. The janitor was no longer just a witness. He was now a tool in the Mechanicus investigation. But as they descended, he couldn't shake one chilling realization. If they didn't find proof, he would be executed for tampering. If they did find proof, they might all be too late. The deeper they went, the more the hive changed. Pipes sweated putrid slime, rust pulsed like infected flesh. Every corridor breathed with a slow, nauseating rhythm, as though the hive itself were becoming something living, something wrong. Even the tech priest's mechanical eyes flickered uneasily, his auspex readings spiking in ways that defied logic. The janitor could feel the sickness thickening the air. It coated the back of his throat, filled his lungs with a humid, rotten warmth. He had never felt so small, or so responsible for what was coming. Finally, they reached it. The chamber, the place where he had first seen the cult. But it was no longer a hidden nest of whispers and candles. Now it was a blossoming cathedral of corruption. A massive growth, like a pulsating organ, hung from the ceiling. Tubes of diseased tissue burrowed into the metal walls. The floor, writhed with tendrils, and kneeling beneath it, dozens of workers, once human, now twisted into swollen, pustulent shapes, chanting in voices that sloshed like boiling bile. The tech priest froze. Even his machine brain could not deny what stood before them. Nurgle, The Plague Father. The rot made flesh. This was no rumor. No contamination. This was a birth. A new infestation, ready to spread through the hive like wildfire. The Skitarii raised their weapons, too slowly. The cultists surged forward with a roar of wet lungs. A wave of bodies slammed into them. Metal tore through flesh, but the plague-swollen figures felt no pain. They clawed, bit, tore, coughing clouds of thick green mist that ate through ceramite plating. The janitor stumbled backward, coughing violently as a tendril wrapped around his ankle and pulled him toward the central growth. He clawed at the ground, screaming, but the hive only groaned back. The tech priest, half crushed beneath a cultist, extended a servo claw toward him. The core structure, the growth, destroy it, he rasped. But how? The janitor shouted. You know these systems. Do it. And the janitor realized, he did know these tunnels. Every pipe, every vent, every maintenance valve. He had scrubbed them for decades. He knew how to collapse this entire sector. He scrambled toward a junction panel, one he had repaired 100 times before. His trembling fingers tore it open, exposing ancient wires and pressure seals. Behind him, the tech priest screamed as tendrils swallowed him whole. The janitor hesitated. Pulling these seals would cause a chain reaction, a vacuum implosion in the lower sectors. It would destroy the growth, destroy the cult, stop the plague, but it would also kill everyone down here, including him. His breath shook. He heard the chittering laughter of the growth behind him. He saw the swollen silhouettes closing in. He felt the hive itself begin to pulse faster, as though waking. He whispered a prayer, not to any saint he knew, but to the emperor he had spent a lifetime believing was too distant to hear him. And then he pulled the seals. All of them. The effect was instant. A thunderous roar tore through the chamber. Air was ripped away in a violent vacuum, sucking the cultists off their feet and tearing them apart. The central growth spasmed, bloating, shrieking in a voice that was not a voice, before collapsing inward as the metal walls buckled. The hive shook, pipes ruptured, buildings swayed, the entire lower sector imploded in a single, deafening collapse. Then, silence. Only dust and the memory of what almost consumed the city remained. Hours later, emergency crews dug through the rubble. Millions of citizens panicked as alarms blared across the hive. When the Mechanicus teams reached the collapsed sector, they found something unexpected. One survivor, the janitor, barely conscious, lungs scarred, skin burned, but alive. They asked him what happened. He only answered, I just cleaned up the mess. He was carried away on a stretcher, covered in grime, blood, soot, and victory. He didn't ask for a medal. He didn't receive a statue. His name was not broadcast across the hive, but in the sealed records of the Adeptus Mechanicus, in the encrypted archives of the Inquisition, and in the quiet prayers of the Emperor's faithful, one line would forever remain. A low-level sanitation worker prevented a Nurgle outbreak. A single janitor saved an entire hive city. And no one ever knew. With that said, thanks for watching and until next time.